Thank you very much, Your Royal Highness, and thank you very much for all of you. I'm delighted to be able to share with you for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have questions afterwards. What I think we basically need to understand, both in global warming and as His Royal Highness also pointed to, in thinking about doing good for the planet in general. So basically, I'd like to talk about global warming, but before we go there, I'd just like to make a brief mention on why is it we worry about global warming. Presumably our goal is to do good in the world. It's not predominantly just about cutting temperature or cutting CO2, but to actually enact good. And so this has to be something about not just doing something that's fashionable, but doing something that actually is rational. And that means doing good rather than just feeling very, very magnanimous, feeling like we're doing something good. That also means that we need to remove our myths. There's lots of myths in many, many different areas of public policy, but I think it's probably particularly worrisome to the extent that we have it in global warming. And again, if we have myths, we're unlikely to make good judgments. Certainly, many of the myths that we have in global warming are, as was just alluded to, ideas of almost apocalypse, and being panicked is unlikely to be a good guide to make great decisions on how we tackle global warming. The last point I just want to make before we start is really to remember we need to spend our money in the best possible way. We really cannot use our money twice. So if we spend it one place where it does little good, it means we cannot spend that money elsewhere. So if we over-worry about some problems and over-worry about them in an incorrect fashion, it means we end up under-worrying about other places. So fundamentally, we need to start taking our responsibility seriously and ask, how can we best tackle global warming? How can we best do good in the world? And ultimately end up leaving this planet a better place. So that's really what I'd like to talk to you about today. Fundamentally, global warming is a huge issue. There's lots and lots of different discussions around it. I'm just going to try to whittle it down to 4 simple points. And I've showed you this picture on Al Gore because no discussion about global warming is complete without a picture of him. So we got that over with. Al Gore and I gave a presentation to Congress a couple of years ago. I'm sure this is the second before he realizes who I am, because he's still smiling. But the point is, of course, that both Gore and many, many others participate in this debate. And I'm sure everyone wants to do the best they can in this debate. But I think we need to have a better handle on how do we actually achieve that. So again, I would like to share with you 4 simple points. It is by no means the full totality of the discussion, and I'm sure we can bring up some of those points afterwards in the discussions, but it does give us an understanding that's possible to share among many people, as we do need to in a democracy. The UN Climate Panel publishes 3 800-page reports every year that just simply summarizes the thousands and possibly even tens of thousands of peer-reviewed published articles that have come out just over the last couple of years. There's no way we can have a discussion on the basis of that. That's why I would propose that if we can get those 4 basic points into our global warming discussion, we will have advanced far in order to get to a point where we can deal sensibly with global warming. My first point is global warming is real, it's man-made, it is important, it is something we need to tackle. So this is not a discussion of saying, oh, there's nothing to global warming. This is actually true, and I would actually like to point out we should thank Al Gore for having put it on the agenda. Al Gore has made it clear to many people, perhaps especially the right wing in the US, that global warming is not just an invention of the left wing to raise taxes. It actually is a real problem. And again, I would argue that our best information comes from the UN Climate Panel, the IPCC. This certainly does not mean that the UN Climate Panel is infallible, as we've learned over the last couple of months. The IPCC very famously claimed that the glaciers of the Himalayas would be gone by 2035. Of course, no such thing will happen. And it was very clear an incidence of where we show agitation, and we want to get people to move in the right direction, so we amplify the scientific results, perhaps a little too much, perhaps in some cases way too much. That's no good way to give evidence or give us understanding of how we should tackle global warming. But it doesn't mean that the UN Climate Panel in general isn't telling us, yes, global warming is happening, and pretty much in the order of magnitude of what's going to happen. That's why I would say, and that's what most, I think, would say in this debate, this is what should be our starting point. Unfortunately, it often is not. So I'll get back to that. But let's take a look at what is the likely impact of global warming towards the end of the century. Well, the UN Climate Panel tells us it's going to be about 2.6 degrees higher than the global temperature will be 2.6 degrees higher than what it is today, somewhere between 1.6 and 3.8 degrees. That doesn't sound like so much, but it's important to recognize that this is a global average, and that means it will have significant impacts. If you ask the economists, and I think that's one of the advantages that economists bring to this conversation, they try to calculate all the impacts, both positive and negative, but obviously there'll be many more negative impacts, which is why global warming is a problem. They tried to tell us, okay, overall, how big of a problem is global warming? And they tell us the estimate is on the order of $15 trillion. That's the total cost of the impact of global warming, or the amount of money you have to set aside to reimburse everyone around the world in all natural systems across all time. It gives you a sense of proportion. This is certainly a big number. It's made a bit smaller from the last financial crisis, but still, it's a big number that ought to make most of us sit up straight in our chairs and say, all right, this is a problem. We need to take this seriously. We need to find the right way to tackle it. But we can also put this in perspective and say, well, what's the net worth, for instance, of the 21st century? And the estimate from the economists is that's about $3,000 trillion. So it gives you a sense of proportion. Global warming is a real problem. It's about $15 trillion, but it's also important to keep it in check with what is the total size of the 21st century. Well, it's about $3,000 trillion. So global warming is about half a percentage point of the 21st century. And that underscores the point. Global warming is not nothing, but it's not the end of the world either. It's about half a percentage point of the problems of the 21st century. So it gives you a sense of proportion. We need to tackle it. We also need to remain calm and actually ask, how do we tackle this in the best possible way? We do not make that choice right now, and I think that's why we need to have a more sensible conversation. Let's find a smart strategy. So my first point is just and simply to say, global warming is real, it's man-made, it is an important problem, it's not the end of the world, but it's not nothing either. Let's start talking about point number 2, which is basically that the consequences we hear on global warming are often vastly exaggerated, often very one-sidedly reported, and that leads to panic and bad judgment. We need to get away from that, and I'd like to share with you a few of those incidences. Here again, Al Gore is an obvious proponent for saying this is the end of the world. Al Gore tells us that this is a planetary emergency, that this could be the end of civilization as we know it. Again, I'm not picking on Al Gore just to pick on him, because so many other people say the same thing, but he's just become a very visible proponent for this. And I would like to just take you through this one quote, which is from his website for his film, An Inconvenient Truth, where he tells us, we have just 10 years to avert a major catastrophe that could send our entire planet into a tailspin of epic destruction, involving extreme weather, floods, droughts, epidemics, killer heat waves, beyond anything we've ever experienced. That sounds like something we want to avoid. But I would like to take you through just a few of these. Let's just take a look at 3 of these claims. Obviously, I'd love to take you through more, but given the time limit, let's just take a look at 3 of these issues. He says that we're going to see more heat deaths and heat waves. Let's look at that. He also says that we're going to see more flooding. Well, let's take a look at sea level rise. He also talks about more epidemics. Let's take a look at malaria. These are by no means the only places, but actually, if you look at all of these instances, there is some truth to all of these claims, but they are very dramatically one-sided and very dramatically exaggerated, and they do not lead us to make good judgments. Let's take a look at killer heat waves. Are we going to see more higher mortality because of more heat in the atmosphere because of global warming? Absolutely. It's really not very complicated. As temperatures rise, we're going to see more heat waves, and hence we're going to see more people dying from heat. It's very, very simple. Actually, we have some of the best studies from a cross-national study done in Europe of about 50 researchers in around 2000. They also estimate it for Britain. They estimate it for pretty much all areas in Europe, both the number of heat and cold deaths that would be incurred. And they actually estimated that for the UK in 2050, because of global warming, we're likely to see about 2,000 more people die every year. We should definitely be honest about that. We should be out there and saying, this is a problem with global warming. That's absolutely true. The problem I have with this argument is, shouldn't we also recognize as temperatures rise, we're going to see more heat waves and hence more heat deaths? Yes, but we're also going to see fewer cold waves and hence fewer cold deaths. Shouldn't we say that? Well, of course, if this was a trivial number, maybe it wouldn't matter, but we do have the numbers. And they're not trivial. Actually, more people virtually everywhere die from cold than from heat. So possibly we want to entertain both of these issues, not just talking about the one-sided heat deaths, but also talk about how many more people would not die from cold. And we know the numbers, because the exact same studies that show that 2,000 more people are going to die from heat also shows that by 2050, because of global warming in the UK, we estimate that about 20,000 fewer people are going to die from cold. Now, it seems to me that we are poorly informed if everyone tells us 2,000 more people are going to die, which is true, but we're not being told that 20,000 fewer people are going to die. We need to know both. Now, of course, you'd be excused. I was on a Colbert report in the US when my book came out, and he introduced me as, here's a guy who says global warming might be good for you. He's from, surprise, Denmark. And of course, we would probably enjoy it both in Denmark and probably also here if it got a little hotter, but surely that cannot be true in general. Well, actually, if you look at the only peer-reviewed study that looked at all the impacts on both heat and cold death across the entire globe, showed that almost all places, except for sub-Saharan Africa, would see more avoided cold deaths than extra heat deaths, totally on about 400,000 extra heat deaths and about 1.8 million fewer cold deaths, or globally about 1.4 million fewer deaths because of global warming, just from heat and cold. We're not talking about other problems here. Isn't that surprising that we only hear one side of that argument, but not the other? And is that a good way to inform our debate? Now, this does not mean that I'm saying, hey, maybe we should have more global warming, because fundamentally, there's lots of impacts from global warming, some positive, some negative. There are more negatives than positives, which is why global warming is a problem. But to neglect to tell us all of both the positives and negatives is unlikely to make for a good debate. And it does so in another way as well, because it informs us of just one way to tackle these heat deaths. Do you remember the great European heat wave in August 2003? It still has reverberations. It killed about 35,000 people around Europe, mostly in Paris, about 7,500, mostly older, elderly women died in Paris. And a lot of people say, this is the kind of thing that we're going to see much more from because of global warming. So in order to help these people, in order to honor their memory, we have to cut our carbon emissions. Now, it sounds very beautiful, and it sounds very caring, but my question is that really going to help elderly women in Paris, France in the future? If you think about it, what they're saying is essentially, yes, because of global warming, temperatures are going to keep rising. They're going to get hotter and hotter. More and more old women in Paris, France are going to die. But we will make sure that slightly fewer more women are going to die in Paris, France towards the end of the century by cutting back carbon emissions. That's not a very ambitious target, is it? We're going to make sure slightly fewer, more and more women are going to die in Paris, France by the end of the century. Couldn't we do it better? Yes, of course we could. There are much better ways to tackle if we want to avoid heat deaths. I mean, there's a very, very sensible point in realizing that while many people still die from heat in Europe, virtually no one dies from heat in the US. Why? Air conditioning. If we worry about old women dying in Paris from heat deaths, should we cut down our carbon emissions and make sure that slightly fewer, but still many, many more are going to die by the end of the century? Or should we give them air conditioning so they stop dying? Again, a lot of people, and reasonably so, worry about this because then we're going to use more fossil fuels from air conditioning, and that's a reasonable concern. But if you worry about heat deaths, you should address that, and you should address it effectively, which is, for instance, through air conditioning, rather than worrying about it through cutting carbon emissions, which is in a very inefficient way of helping future generations. But moreover, there are other and much exposed ways that we could deal with heat deaths. We know that most cities around the world are much, much warmer than their surrounding countrysides. Most major cities have actually seen dramatically increasing temperatures this century, much more than what we're expecting from global warming last century than what we're expecting from global warming this century, because they have lots of asphalt, lots of black surfaces and very little water and very little greenery. Actually, Tokyo probably holds the world record. In August, Tokyo is about 12.5 degrees warmer than its surrounding countryside. So if we care about people again, why is it we don't focus on some of these very, very simple things? Most people live in cities today. We estimate that somewhere between 70 and 90% are going to be living in cities by the end of the century. So we could help the vast majority of humankind if we focused on making cities cooler. And we know how to do that. We have actually done studies both for Los Angeles, for New York, and for London. If you take a look for London, if you added more water and more greenery, apart from the fact that this would make London more beautiful, it would also reduce heat time temperatures about 8 degrees in London, much, much more than what we're expecting to come from global warming. And we could do it much cheaper, and we could do it today. Or perhaps very, very sensibly and very straightforwardly, if the problem is that there's lots of black surfaces in cities, why don't we stop doing that? Why don't we put more light surfaces, paint the tarmac, or paint the rooftops? Why do they have to be black? And lots of studies have shown that if you do this sensibly, that is when rooftops have to be replaced, or if you do it when surfaces and tarmac has to be replaced, we could do this very, very cheaply, and we could actually reduce heat wave temperatures in London by about 10 degrees centigrade. So again, my point here is doubly to tell you, you're being told that there's going to be more killer heat waves. That's absolutely true. But what you're not being told is that there's going to be significantly fewer cold wave deaths. And that will actually dramatically outweigh the increased heat wave deaths. And you're also being told that the only way to tackle this is cut carbon emissions. Isn't it curious how the only solution ever is cut carbon emissions, really no matter what the question was. But really, there's a much, much smarter way to do this, namely by investing in cooler cities, paint the tarmac, or increase the amount of greenery and water, or to give people air conditioning. Simple, cheap solutions that will actually do the trick. Now, this does not mean we shouldn't tackle global warming, but it does mean that if you're going to say, I care about killer heat waves, you should also say, well, there's going to be many, many fewer people dying from cold, and you should also say, but there's much, much smarter solutions to caring about people dying in killer heat waves. And this argument actually goes through all of the different scares that we hear about. Al Gore also mentioned that we're going to see more flooding, and this is generally true. Yes, sea levels will rise, and all other things equal, we will likely see more flooding. But let's again remember, this is not the catastrophe that we're being shown. The UN Climate Panel estimate that we're going to see sea level rises somewhere between 18 and 59 centimeters over this century, most likely about 30 centimeters. And that's not the 20 feet or 6 meters of sea level rise that Al Gore showed in his film, and that we are often sort of being tickled with in the public discussion. I don't know how many of you have seen Al Gore's film, but even if you haven't seen it, you've probably seen the most popular clip from his film, where he shows what 20 meters sea level rise would do around the world. He shows how that would flood most of Florida, and flood most of San Francisco, and flood most of New York, and flood most of Holland, and flood most of Bangladesh, and flood most of Shanghai. It's a very long film, and flood most of Beijing. And of course, that's true if we had 6 meters of sea level rise, but we're likely to see 30 centimeters. And that's a very different impact, and we should be honest about that. Actually, how much of a problem is 30 centimeters? Well, we know, because over the last century and a half, sea levels rose about 30 centimeters. Did anyone realize? Imagine asking a very old person who's lived through most of the 20th century, likely to be a woman, and ask her, what were the important things that happened in the 20th century? She'll talk about the world wars, the suffrage for women, maybe the IT revolution, but it's very unlikely that she'll say, and sea levels rose, right? And it underscores the point that yes, this is a problem. Yes, it will have cost, but it's not something that we can't deal with. It's not something that our forefathers with much less technology, with much less infrastructure with much less wealth we're able to tackle very, very well. So why would we expect that this would be the end of civilization for us now? And perhaps moreover, if we actually care about helping people to tackle sea level rise, are we doing the right thing? Again, we're being told the only way to do this is by cutting carbon emissions. Well, let's take a look at how we possibly could help. Take a look, for instance, at the Maldives. The Maldives is a great example because they look so beautiful and they're obviously very, very close to sea level. And let's take a look at how much would 30 centimeters of sea level rise incur on Maldives. Well, if we just look at the ISO curves, essentially how high up is the Maldives right now, a flooding of 30 centimeters would actually flood 77% of the Maldives, and the total cost to the Maldives, discounted back to today, would be on the order of 121% of their GDP. That's a bad outcome. But notice this sort of outcome, which you very often hear about, is estimating that the Maldives will do nothing. That's essentially imagining me standing on the beach of the Maldives in 2020 and watching the waves lap up over my knees and saying, wow, if I stay here for another 80 years, I'm going to drown. And then stay there? That's not how people actually act, right? We actually implement, we adapt to these very often, and that's, of course, how our forefathers did this. We actually build dikes and we take action so that this does not happen. Actually, economic estimates show that for about 0.04% of the GDP from the Maldives, they can safeguard virtually all their dry land. Now, my question is, will the Maldives spend 0.04% of their GDP to avoid a loss of 121% of their GDP? Yeah. Which is what has happened in the past and will very likely happen in the future. So first of all, we have to contend with the argument that we're going to see flooding of virtually everything. No, we will see cost going into having more protection. And that will be costly in the order of 0.1% of GDP, but nowhere near the end of civilization. And that will safeguard virtually all dry land, except very few places, Alaska, Canada, Siberia. The second part is, again, is the best way to help the Maldives to cut carbon emissions. Well, actually, sorry, I didn't include that, but let me just tell you that anyway. The UN tells us that there's two basic scenarios. One is if you focus on economic growth, which is essentially the A scenario, the A1 scenario of the UN Climate Panel. The other one is one where we worry much more about environment, which is typically known as the B1 scenario, if we do it in a smart sort of way. Both of these scenarios envision that we're going to get much richer towards the end of the century. Also, both of them envision that we're going to see some global warming. But of course, in the economic scenario, we're going to get much, much richer. We're going to have an average income towards the end of the century of about $71,000 per person. That means that as a globe, we will get somewhere around 16 times richer than what we are today. We have a hard time imagining that, but remember, of course, that's pretty much what happened in the last century as well for the world. We're not going to get as much richer. We're going to get somewhere between 4 and 8 times richer, but the developing countries will get much, much richer on the order of somewhere between 16 and 32 times richer. So the fundamental point is by the end of the century, we'll be much, much richer, but we'll also have a higher sea level. In the economic scenario, we'll have about 34 centimeters of sea level rise in this particular simulation. There's another solution you could call the Al Gore solution, which is one where we worry much more about environment. We'll still be much richer by the end of the century, but not quite as rich. We'll be about 1/3 less rich towards the end of the century as a planet. But we will also have about 1/3 less sea level rise. We'll only have about 22 centimeters instead of 34 centimeters. So the simple question here is, these are the two main UN scenarios. We can pick an economically focused scenario with more wealth, but also more sea level rise. Or we can pick one where we still have much more wealth towards the end of the century, but somewhat less wealth and somewhat less sea level rise. Al Gore and many others would suggest that we should go down that route of caring more about the environment. Which of these two scenarios would help the Maldives the most? If we just look at the amount of lost dry land. You'd imagine the Al Gore scenario would be better, right? Because at least they would only have 22 centimeters of sea level rise to contend with instead of 34. You'd also be wrong, because what we forget is that it doesn't only matter how much the sea level rise, it also matters how rich the Maldives are towards the end of the century. If the Maldives are richer, they're better able to protect themselves. It actually turns out that of all our goodwill, in all our want to cut carbon emissions and help the Maldives by making sea levels rise slower and also making them less rich, we actually end up consigning them to a future where they lose 3 times more dry land than if we'd focused on making them richer and that hence better able to deal with the problems that are going to come from global warming. So again, the point is not to contend the fact that Al Gore and many others have goodwill. I think they do. But the question is, are we also asking the right question? What are the policies that will actually help the Maldives the most? And of course, what we do need to make sure is that the Maldives have adaptive capacity to tackle the problems they're going to get from global warming. So again, yes, Al Gore's right to talk about that there's going to be more flooding, but he's wrong in suggesting that it's going to be the end of the world. It's not going to be. It's going to be about what we saw the last 150 years. And he's certainly wrong in telling us that the best way to help the Maldives and many other places is by invoking the cutting carbon emissions, because essentially it's in a very inefficient way to help the Maldives. Now, you may say the Maldives is a very small place, but it's actually true for also the other Tuvalu and Micronesia, but perhaps more importantly, for the big vulnerable places like Vietnam and Bangladesh. Both of them will actually lose about 3 times more dry land if we pick the environmentally conscious strategy. So again, the point here is not to say that Al Gore doesn't have a point, but that we're being led in the wrong direction, that we're being told a very exaggerated number that's not very helpful for our conversation. Let me just show you the third point, the idea that we're going to see more epidemics. We're going to see more, for instance, malaria. Well, it's true that malaria is weakly correlated to heat, so we're expecting to see about 3% more malaria by the end of the century because of global warming. But what we're, of course, forgetting to tell everyone is that malaria is strongly correlated to wealth. Basically, if you're rich, you don't get malaria, and even if you get malaria, you don't die from malaria. Whereas, of course, if you're poor, you get malaria and you die from malaria. And so, again, the question is, why is it we're so focused on cutting temperature rather than focusing on cutting treatment, for instance, or sorry, instigating treatment for malaria? Fundamentally, why is it we're so worried about 3% more malaria in 100 years rather than thinking about the 100% malaria that is here right now that we could very easily do something about? And let me show you that in a very clear sort of manner. If everyone did the Kyoto Protocol, which is more than what the world has managed to do today, it's about 20 times more than what the world has managed to do today, but let's just assume that we could all get around, agree to it, and continue to agree to it throughout this century. How many people would we actually save from malaria? Well, you don't hear this very often, but if you run the models, it turns out that we would probably save about 1,400 people every year from dying from malaria. I want to be a part of a civilization that cares enough about people that we're trying to save 1,400 people from dying every year. I think that's beautiful. But what I worry about and what I'm a little confused about is the fact that we don't care very much about making malaria-specific policies that every year would save about 850,000 people from dying from malaria. Isn't that better? And of course, we also have to remember there's a very different cost. The cost of Kyoto is about $180 billion, whereas the cost of malaria-specific policies is about $3 billion. So to put it very bluntly, every time a climate-induced policy could save one person from dying from malaria, the same amount of money spent on malaria could save 36,000 people from dying from malaria. I would simply suggest that it's better to save 36,000 people than one. And that's really the point here in this discussion. It's not to say that global warming is not real. It's not to say that we don't have to tackle it, but it is to say only to tell us about the negative impacts of global warming and forgetting about the positives, only to exaggerate and not tell us the right amount, and only to tell us that one solution is the right solution to every problem, namely cut carbon emissions, when indeed there are much, much better policy solutions to virtually every problem we can come up with, where we'd end up spending less money, doing more good first. Seems to me to not be the morally valid way to move about this. So yes, global warming is real, but it's often vastly exaggerated, leading to bad judgment. That's why we need to find smarter solutions. That's what the third point I'd like to mention to you. So global warming is real, it's often vastly exaggerated. Let's find out how we actually deal with the smarter solutions. Obviously, the solutions that we have right now are not working, and they're not working simply because they're incredibly expensive ways of doing virtually no good. Kyoto, which is the only thing that we've actually all agreed to, would cost, and this is the best case estimate, notice, if everyone had done this smartly, the cost would have been about $180 billion a year. This is the average of all the macroeconomic models that have looked at it. Yet the impact by the end of the century would have been indistinguishable. It's about 0.004 degrees reduction in temperature for the 5 years of Kyoto. Of course, we haven't done anything like it, and so now the actual reduction that we're looking at is probably going to be about 0.0002 degrees. I mean, obviously, we can't even measure this impact. So we essentially said, let's spend lots of money and do no good 100 years from now. That's not a great way to be remembered by your kids and grandkids. Of course, the EU has then said, well, let's try to do it even more. They've said that they're going to cut carbon emissions by 20% by 2020 by employing 20% renewables. I don't think there's any good reason for this except it sounds good. It's the 20-20-20 decision. The cost is estimated, if you look at the macroeconomic models again, at about $250 billion a year, $250 billion every year by 2020. Yet the impact is going to be about a 20th of a degree centigrade. If the EU keeps this all the way through the century, unlike Kyoto, I think the EU probably will do that, but it's a phenomenally expensive way of doing virtually no good even 100 years from now. If you ask the economic models, how much climate damage do you avoid for every dollar spent? The answer is an uncomfortable one. It shows that for every dollar the EU spends, we're going to avoid about half a cent of climate damage in the world. So we're essentially putting out $1 and doing half a cent worth of good. That's an incredibly inefficient way to try to help the world. And of course, the problem is, if you notice in Copenhagen, every leader said, we're going to pledge to a 2 degrees centigrade limit. Well, there's a reason why that's never going to happen. If everyone did this in the most effective way possible, the cost by the end of the century, and notice this is again the estimate of all the macroeconomic models, including, or actually all of the ones that the UN climate panel uses, but they never did this calculation. I'm not quite sure why, but given the number, you can possibly imagine why. It turns out that it's $40 trillion a year. 13% of global GDP it's going to cost us towards the end of the century. That's an incredibly inefficient way, and of course politically absolutely unpalatable solution, which is basically why, again, for every dollar spent, we'll avoid about 2 cents of climate damage. The reason why this is better is because this assumes that China and India and everybody else would also be along, and also that we're assuming here we would do this in the most efficient way, whereas, of course, we know that the EU has already decided to do it in a much less than effective way. But the fundamental point here remains is that we're committed to spending large sums of money doing virtually no good. And why is it never happening? Well, because fundamentally, there's a very strong correlation between GDP growth and CO2 growth. Or to put it differently, if you want to cut CO2, you also have to cut GDP. This is the plot for all the countries and their economic growth. From minus, some countries actually declined over the period from 82 to 2005. Most countries grew, and up here you see the equivalent CO2 growth. And you see a very, very strong correlation. Basically, this is China out here, but fundamentally all of the nations that we care about are positive. A few of them, actually the European Union is just about here, but we also managed a very meager growth rate. Fundamentally, if you want to cut CO2, certainly in the short and medium term, you have to cut your growth rate, which is a politically very hard selling point, let's put it that way. And so that's why it's really, really hard to get anyone to commit to anything. You can get a lot of leaders to promise stuff. You probably all remember Tony Blair promising from 1997 and onwards that he was going to cut Britain's carbon emissions by another 15%. Of course, everybody applauded. It never happened. Your carbon emissions have slightly increased. But that didn't matter because it looked good. But if we actually want to cut carbon emissions, it's not about looking good, it's not about feeling good, it's about actually cutting carbon emissions. And we're never going to get there until we get smarter policies. So let me try and talk to you about what would be smarter policy. But before I do that, let me just give you a little story, which I think in many ways sort of encompasses this whole discussion. If we talk about polar bears, everybody recognizes polar bears as the extreme icon of global warming. And I think in many ways it encompasses the whole discussion of how we're being misinformed and also how we're not thinking clearly about these issues. Polar bears are endangered. That's certainly the impression that we have. Well, it is true that polar bears, with diminishing and eventually disappearing summer Arctic ice, are going to have a harder time. Absolutely. But the idea that they're imperiled right now is simply wrong. We know that the data, and this will probably surprise you as much as it surprised me, has increased, the global population has increased about fourfold over the last half century, from about 5,000 in global population to about 22,000 now. This doesn't mean that global warming will not have an impact and possibly make the population decline, and possibly quite dramatically in the future. But it's important to recognize that that's not what's happened over the last half century. And moreover, if we want to safeguard the future of the polar bear, what can we do? Well, the solution that most people come up with is, well, let's cut carbon emissions. Of course, that's, again, the solution to everything. Actually, how much would it help polar bears if we cut our carbon emissions? If we just implemented the Kyoto Protocol, which of course the world hasn't done, if we did 20 times more than what the world has actually managed to do till today, and persevered all the way through the century, this is a very, very high demand compared to what we've done, how much would we actually do? Well, you don't usually hear this, but if you run the numbers, the indication is that this would save about 1 polar bear every year. Now, I'm all for saving a polar bear, even a couple $100 billion, but it strikes me as bizarre that we focus so much on a policy that would help 1 polar bear every year at a couple $100 billion, when every year we shoot polar bears. And not just a few of them. I don't know how many of you know, but we shoot every year somewhere between 300 and 500 polar bears. And my simple point here is similar. If we care about polar bears, what about stopping shooting 300 polar bears first? Apart from the fact that it would be a couple $100 billion cheaper, it would also help 299 more polar bears every year. Now, and this is not meant to be flippant. Of course, this does not change the long-term issue that we need to tackle global warming. But the fact that we're just simply unable to think straight in this conversation and think about what would actually work right now. Help save the polar bears, stop shooting them. And then, of course, get to the point where we can actually tackle global warming. But it does make it less important that we do right today. And that gives us time to find the smart solutions instead. And what is the smart solutions? Well, fundamentally, it'll have to be innovation. Right now, solar panels are incredibly expensive, which means a few well-meaning Westerners will put them up on their rooftops, feel very good about themselves, but it won't actually solve global warming. Now, the question is the solution to global warming then to force more people to put up these incredibly inefficient solar panels, or to innovate the price down to the point where fossil fuels become more expensive than solar panels, and hence everyone will buy them? Of course, the solution is the latter. I actually help oversee something called the Copenhagen Consensus for Climate, where we asked some of the world's top climate economists, including 28 of the world's top climate economists, including 3 Nobel laureates, to look at all the different solutions. And this was the solution that they said long-term is the best and most efficient way to tackle global warming. So what I would propose, and what we really do need to do in order to tackle global warming, is to invest dramatically more in research and development into green energy. Because if we do that, we will be able to get the technologies that not just rich, well-meaning Westerners will implement, but also the Chinese and the Indians and everybody else will want, because they're cheaper than fossil fuels. I propose we should spend, this is the result from all the Nobel economists, spend 0.2% of our GDP on research, development, demonstration, and non-carbon emitting energy technologies. This would be about $100 billion a year. It'd be twice as cheap as Kyoto, and it'd be 50 times more than what the world spends today. The point is, we would do much more with much less and have much greater impact. Now, again, I don't know if it's going to be solar panels. I think we should be looking at all the different areas, be it renewables, fission, fusion, conservation, second-generation biofuels, carbon storage. There are lots of potential solutions. I don't think we can pick any one of them right now and say that's going to be the solution. But if we invest in the broad board of all of these, some of them are going to come true, and they're the ones who will power the rest of the 21st century. The amazing thing is this would actually fix global warming in the medium term. It wouldn't help polar bears right away, but of course stopping shooting them would. And then in the long run, we can stop using fossil fuels because we have made it cheaper. And the last point, and this is from an economics point of view, the most important, this would actually do an amazing amount of good. For every dollar we spent, we would avoid about $11 of climate damage. So instead of spending a dollar and only doing a couple of cents worth of good, we would do 500 times more good, and we would actually do real good with our money that we spend on helping the world, not just feeling good, not just feeling magnanimous, but actually solving problems for the future. And so my 3 points is really just global warming is real. It's often vastly exaggerated, which has led to really poor decisions. That's why we need to have smarter decisions. And those decisions really very, very clearly are about the pragmatic solutions to problems that we have right now. Make cooler cities if heat waves are the problem. Stop shooting polar bears if the problem is polar bears. And then find a long-term solution to climate change, which is innovation. The only way that we're actually going to get everybody on board, much cheaper, much more effective, and ultimately will fix global warming. I promised you 4 points, and I'll make this very brief because I know I'm over my time. But let me just briefly end this on the point of realizing that global warming is not the only problem in the world. And again, if we want to help people, we've got to ask ourselves, why are we so predominantly occupied with global warming, almost to the exclusion of every other problem? Al Gore talks about global warming as our generational mission, and I think that's exactly right. He says, how do you want to be remembered? How do you want to be remembered by your kids and by your grandkids? I think that's exactly the right question. How do you want to be remembered? The amazing thing to me is that Al Gore and many, many other well-meaning people that I know want to be remembered spending hundreds of billions of dollars doing virtually no good 100 years from now. I'm just not sure our kids and grandkids are going to say, great going there, Granddad. And just to give you a sense of proportion, the UN estimate that for less than half this amount, for about $75 billion a year, we could solve all major basic problems. We could give clean drinking water, sanitation, basic health care, and education to every single human being on the planet. I would just like you to take consideration for just a second, how would you like to be remembered? Spending twice as much money doing virtually no good 100 years from now, or spending half that amount of money and fixing all major problems right now? It's not that hard to choose, is it? But presumably, we have just simply lost track of realizing if we want to do good now, there's lots of other issues where we need to focus our immediate attention. This does not mean we shouldn't also tackle global warming, but it does mean we need to tackle it much more effectively. We need to tackle it much more goal-oriented, without the fear, without the scare tactics, and that's about investing dramatically more in green energy research and development so that eventually we'll get everybody on board, not because they're scared silly, but because we have made it a smart investment to invest in green energy. Thank you.